Well, welcome to the Get Fit with Jodelle podcast. It's time once again for Dr. Ray Peat. He's joined me and is always so gracious with his time. And I could go on and on about his laundry list of credentials and how long he's been teaching and researching nutrition, in addition to authoring many books and publications, longer than many of us have been alive. And that's what makes him what I consider to be one of the leading authorities in nutrition, and more specifically, women's hormonal health. So, Dr. Peat, thank you so much for coming back. How are you?
Very well.
Awesome. Well, before we get started with this great lineup of questions that so many of our listeners have put together for you, I wanted to ask you kind of some rapid fire questions about yourself, just so the audience can learn who Ray Peat is. So these are just a few that popped off the top of my head that I thought I'd ask you. So the first one is your favorite food.
Depends on whether it's for practicality or for taste. By the deliciousness of a food, probably things like cheese, grilled cheese sandwich, or huevos rancheros, Mexican style. But for practicality, any kind of cheese and milk, those are my basic staples.
Okay, favorite animal?
Ants, I think.
Really? Okay, I have to ask why.
They're intelligent, and they aren't bees and wasps are equally intelligent, but they tend to outsmart me, and I can deal with ants and reason with them.
I love that. Okay, so since you paint, how about your favorite artist?
It has generally been Renoir, just because I like my manner of painting sort of assimilates all of his different styles seem comfortable for me.
How about your favorite place that you've ever visited?
Probably some spots in the jungle of Mexico.
Wow. And how about someone you admire?
Most of them have died, basically.
Yeah.
Ralph Nader is a living person that I admire.
And how about someone who has passed on that you admire?
Albert St. George, William Blake, a whole line of philosophers, biologists, educators, mostly dissenters and very outside the culture thinkers.
I'm so glad you mentioned Albert St. George, because I actually had a question that I wanted to ask you. Since you tend to talk thyroid a lot, I wanted to know your thoughts on iodine supplementation, and I had read something about Albert St. George with iodine. What are your thoughts? The reason I had looked it up was I've read and researched that it can be protective against 5G, and wanted to know how you feel about it.
I have noticed that St. George has been misquoted on iodine. In one of his books, he doing in cells. And very slight excess of iodine can disrupt the function of the thyroid gland, as well as the cellular handling of electrons and oxygen. So it's a very touchy thing to supplement. And there are cults. Guy Abraham, he happened to study in the same lab and department that I did for my PhD. So I had brief contact with him, but he announced that he was the world's expert in iodine, and then he advocated taking 10 milligrams a day, or even more, and he got 2 medical doctor followers to continue his tradition, but essentially he was mentally cracked on the subject and totally anti-scientific, and so I think he started a very dangerous tradition in which people think it's safe to take 10 milligrams of iodine per day.
Well, I'm so glad I asked you about that, because one of his publications was one I came across. So you wouldn't be a fan of any sort of iodine supplementation, even in small doses?
Even iodized salt. I have a collection of, I think it's 72 articles on the long-range effects of adding iodine to salt over the last several decades. And even approximately doubling the normal amount of iodine, the minimal amount, is safe, but definitely half a milligram of iodine per day extra over the long run causes thyroid glandular damage.
And so it is important for the thyroid to have iodine, but you might suggest that we just get it through what food we take in, or food from the sea.
For example, cows can't give milk if they're deficient in iodine. The thyroid is essential for reproductive functions, and so eggs and milk are guaranteed to contain adequate iodine. And there was a study in the 60s that found that Americans, almost every American eating a standard diet, had a great excess of iodine in their diet, and at that time it was coming from bread. Iodine was used as a dough conditioner.
Okay, very good. That's what I wanted to know. So always glad I can ask you these things. Okay, we're going to jump into the question queue here. And thank you guys, everybody that submitted questions. You guys are super fun. Whenever I post a thing about I'm going to interview Dr. Peat, you're quick to respond and send in your questions. So just look for those posts on YouTube every now and then, and you'll be able to ask Dr. Peat anything you want. Mike is our first one here. Mike's up and he says, can you ask Dr. Peat about how to safely build muscle mass using weights and if a calorie surplus is needed? And then a sample diet for dropping body fat.
Anything that helps you build muscle helps you lose fat, because muscle is where most of our calories are oxidized. Just passively sitting, your muscles burn almost pure fat. So having big muscles and sitting around all day, you won't get fat if you eat the right amount of calories for your activity. And the Eastern Europeans in the 1930s and their secret, I guess some of them did dope with testosterone, but their method of training caused their bodies to naturally increase the ratio of testosterone to cortisol. The muscle tissue shrinks under the influence of cortisol and grows under the influence of testosterone, so it's a constant balance. And if a person is under stress, their little bit of testosterone that the body can manage to produce binds to the heart, lungs, and brain. The heart muscle is powerfully protected by testosterone. And it happens that these hormones are metabolized. Every cell that has been studied in the right circumstance turns out to be able to create steroids. The skin is one of our major steroid-forming organisms. It can even produce the pituitary hormones needed to stimulate its own production of steroids. And muscle cells can produce testosterone, and if they are not stressed, the right amount of exertion, especially concentric contraction, contracting against resistance, shifts the balance towards actually producing some testosterone locally, as well as responding to testosterone and blocking cortisol shrinking effect. But if the cell reaches the level of activity that it can't gain enough oxygen from the blood, then it begins producing lactic acid, and at that point it shifts over to actually producing some internal cortisol, but the whole body system, under the influence of lactic acid, shifts into the stress mode. And so the Eastern Europeans found that if the trainer would watch for the point at which lactic acid began to form and made the athlete stop training, it always seemed far too early for the athletes. But when the trainer made them stop training so much, then their performance went tremendously higher.
I love that. That's kind of a strategy that I sometimes employ with my clients when I train them, is let me just get you right to the brink of where that lactic acid starts coming in and then shut it down. So that's pretty cool to know that other trainers in Europe are doing that. So as far as like a sample diet, what would you recommend for Mike?
Making sure that you get enough calcium and vitamin D, which lots of doctors will think that sounds very, very silly, but cachexia or sarcopenia under stress or cancer or aging or hypothyroidism, an extreme, if a person has the thyroid gland removed and doesn't have a supplement, they experience cachexia. The muscles waste away because thyroid hormone is our first anabolic hormone. It activates muscle growth, everything else being adequate. And to do that, it produces energy efficiently, resulting in carbon dioxide adequate to be a barrier. The more carbon dioxide you have the more completely you suppress glycolysis and lactic acid formation. So you can exert more to the extent that you can produce a corresponding amount of carbon dioxide. It's carbon dioxide that holds down the lactate production. And so if you're deficient in calcium and vitamin D, your parathyroid hormone increases to draw calcium out of your bones. And parathyroid hormone is a powerful anti-mitochondrial agent. It suppresses the formation of carbon dioxide and production of energy. So a calcium and vitamin D deficiency is the first step towards wasting of your muscles.
Yeah, we definitely don't want that. So that's a really good recommendation to keep that calcium and vitamin D rich foods going. Okay, Karen asks, I take MSM and glutathione to help with the fact that my naturopath says I don't handle sulfur well. How does one begin to start handling sulfur well, and are you a fan of MSM and glutathione?
Definitely not. Glutathione is, in itself, it's electronically reducing. It tends to donate electrons, like ascorbic acid is a reducing agent, and sulfur compounds are commonly reducing agents. But the whole established biochemical, even still most biochemistry professors are teaching a mistaken idea of how the balance of reducing and oxidizing works in the body. Glutathione, in the stable oxidizing state of the cell, is oxidized into the disulfide form. It's an SS bond rather than an SH bond. Ascorbic acid inside the healthy cell exists as dehydroascorbate. That's why you can cure scurvy very easily by eating meat, even though you can't find any measurable ascorbic acid that they speak of in meat. If you eat it, you get an abundance of ascorbic acid released because it has a lot of the material in the oxidized form as dehydroascorbate. And it works in that form inside the cell. Ascorbic acid is working as an oxidant, and one of the first things it oxidizes is glutathione to put it into the disulfide form. And that locks proteins into a stable anti-stress configuration. When the cell is stressed, injured, reduced, alcohol poisoning, estrogen excess, anything that injures it and causes it to go into a cell division mode, causes a tremendous explosion all through the cell of measurable glutathione, which wasn't there in a resting condition because the dehydroascorbate was keeping it oxidized. And if you happen to eat a reducing agent like glutathione or vitamin C in the presence of even a trace amount of copper or iron or other oxidizing metal, just a trace of those metals will cause tremendous free radical formation and damage from the reducing power of ascorbic acid or NADH or glutathione. Those things should be produced inside the cell only in response to stress. And if you eat them as such, then they're very potentially toxic.
Okay, and then how would she go about starting to handle sulfur well? Because it sounds like she doesn't handle sulfur-rich foods, and she wants to be able to.
The trace elements and vitamins are making sure that you're well nourished for trace elements. For example, eating fish or other seafoods from the ocean. One meal of that a week will provide selenium and other minerals. And having eggs every day will provide not only an abundance of the sulfur amino acids, but also a good balance of the vitamins you need for metabolizing them.
Okay, and then we have Naomi, and she was curious about, she heard that you use hydrogenated coconut oil instead of cold pressed, and she wanted to know why.
The filtration is one thing. The so-called virgin coconut oil, sometimes it has a delicious flavor, which is great for making ice cream. I've made, using no cream at all, but an egg to emulsify the unfiltered coconut oil. You get a delicious, fresh coconut-tasting ice cream. So it's good for flavoring or making cookies or something, but as a staple, those unfiltered, flavorful things contain enzymes that can break down the fats and lead to rancidity, but there are also a lot of allergenic materials, and quite a few people have a bad reaction to unfiltered or poorly filtered coconut oil. And in the process of solidifying it by hydrogenation, they always start with a very well-filtered oil. And then ordinary coconut oil contains around 3% of the polyunsaturated fatty acids. And the small percentage of the PUFA is what makes coconut oil so much safer than other vegetable oils. But still, that 3% over a lifetime, those tend to get stored in your tissues and proceed to their toxic effects. So for total avoidance as far as possible, if I could find a safely hydrogenated butter, I think I would do that, but the process would destroy the good flavor of butter, which is its main value.
Yeah, and I have clients that, they want to fry their eggs and they would go grab the most expensive, unrefined, cold-pressed virgin coconut oil, and they're like, my eggs taste like suntan lotion, and that's why I said, yeah, it's just fine to do the refined, the cheapest coconut oil you can find, the hydrogenated, just fine, because then you also won't have that coconut flavor in there. You're just going to have the nice oil to fry in, so...
Yeah, and you can mix butter and hydrogenated coconut oil, and you still get the butter flavor.
Good, okay. Okay, so the next name is a little hard to pronounce, Upkar. Upkar is the name, Upkar Become. Says, can my wife, who's 51 years of age, take saw palmetto for falling hair? Secondly, can saw palmetto act as Pregnenalone in the body?
It does have some of those actions, but I've never actually seen any good benefits from it. I've been watching because of that analogous steroid effect. It theoretically should have some, but I've just never known anyone to have noticeable results from it.
Okay. All right. Kathleen has a couple questions here. She asks, can you ask Dr. Peat, what about oxalates? What about salicylates? And then also liver detox, specifically glucuronidation for salicylates. Why do some have hypoglycemia from fruit? And then we'll go to a couple more she has after that. But first, your thoughts on oxalates and salicylates and glucuronidation.
Three very separate
yes.
issues. Our body can oxidize oxalic acid, but it isn't necessarily a problem in moderate amounts, but it can bind up minerals. So if you eat it in any quantity, it could steal magnesium, for example, from your diet. So it definitely isn't a good food additive, but in the very small amounts. Plants that have a lot of it can actually take calcium out of your teeth. So I tend to avoid the foods that contain it just because of their damaging effect on magnesium and calcium metabolism. And salicylates, the term is very misleadingly misused. Willow bark and the very few other plants actually contain salicylic acid or actual aspirin acetyl salicylate. But people are using it for basically anything with the benzene ring structure, and that includes almost everything living. And that has led to a kind of cultish fear of fruit. And this same range of molecules contains the incredibly beneficial flavonoid family. Those are often called salicylates, but they have as little to do with salicylate as you can imagine. They have very far-ranging antioxidant effects and antitoxic, very important substances. That's one of the reasons I advocate drinking orange juice as far as you can get a good tasting sweet orange juice without very much citric acid, because citric acid is another thing that damages your teeth. And in large amounts, citric acid, even though it enters the citric acid cycle and can be oxidized, it's another one of those things that is perfectly healthy in its place, but when you eat it, that isn't its proper place in metabolism, and when it's out of its normal place in the system, then it has the potential to be toxic. But fruits, guavas and oranges are among the highest in these flavonoid protective agents, and they, like ascorbic acid, inside the cell, even though they're considered antioxidants, inside the cell their beneficial effect is because they act as catalysts to oxidation, like dehydroascorbate does, tending to keep the cell out of reducing stress.
I'm so glad you said that about fruit, because I I have a hard time believing that something that was intended by a creator in nature to assist us in our health would be inappropriate. Like if it's unadulterated, found in nature, if we had to live off the land, that it would be the perfect food, since it has everything. You don't have to cook it, you don't have to salt it, you don't have to do anything. You take a fruit and you eat it. It's nature's perfect provision.
Yeah, and the squirrel monkey is notoriously long-lived for its size. A squirrel lives maybe 8 or 10 years or something, but the squirrel monkey of the same size lives about 30 years. Very, very unusual for an animal that small. And its diet in nature consists purely of fruit. And it also has one of the biggest brain-to-body ratios, an index of intelligence of all animals. And that demonstrates the power of fruit nutritionally. Fruit and milk are safest natural foods.
And she asks about estrogen and calcium D-glucarate. So would this be helpful for lowering estrogen? What do you think about calcium D-glucarate?
That it has been advocated for an anti-estrogen treatment and an anti-cancer treatment. And it probably has benefit. Logically, glucuronidation is a fundamental way that we rid the body of estrogen. 100% of estrogen should be excreted and not recycled. When the liver is exposed to it, it should be immediately annihilated by attaching glucuronic acid or sulfuric acid to it. But when something damages the liver's metabolic rate, such as hypothyroidism, then the liver can allow all of the estrogen that it receives to pass through unmodified, and that becomes carcinogenic and produces PMS and epilepsy and all of the consequences. And thyroid hormone and good nutrition are the things that activate glucuronidation and sulfotransferase. But theoretically, a supplement like that should add the raw material needed for the process.
Yeah, and the fruits that you mentioned, the guava and the oranges and things like that, they actually help to pull excess estrogen out of the body. So, I mean, yeah, going back to the fruit along with that is going to be really good for that individual as well. Natasha asks about spider veins. So she says, although I suspect he'll mention copper and also the best solutions for a safe deodorant.
Solution for what was the last word?
So the first part is about spider veins, and then the second part is about a safe deodorant.
Oh, deodorant. Yeah. Washing regularly is the safest deodorant. Yeah. But if there's a bacteria growing there or a fungus, a safe antiseptic like sulphur soap, one bath using 10% sulphur soap will sometimes permanently eliminate an underarm odor problem by destroying the microorganism that's causing the fat material to break down. Spider veins traditionally have been associated with chronic unopposed estrogen, and what they're apparently developing in response to is some kind of an oxygen delivery problem in that area of tissue, and things that improve progesterone systemically or topically, and especially thyroid to help you excrete estrogen. Those are things that have traditionally worked.
So yeah, it is more of an estrogen dominant thing that she would be having the spider veins.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Jesse asks, what is the best way to reduce bowel inflammation in cases where one is already addressing thyroid issues and using dietary therapies such as eating carrot salads, bamboo shoots, eggshell powder, and OJ? So reducing bowel inflammation.
Some people find that the particle size of eggshell powder to be a problem, so you might experiment using maybe a coffee grinder that can reduce it to the fineness of a talcum powder, and then take it with food. And trying a different brand of orange juice, I found that some brands that I had used, for example, a frozen orange juice concentrate I had used for years, pulp-free so-called, I noticed that it started causing intense intestinal inflammation, and it also started leaving a residue of a gummy material on the glass after I had drunk it. So I changed brands and found one that was truly pulp-free and had no more inflammation. And sometimes a supplement is the villain. A vitamin D supplement, ascorbic acid tablets, many of the most popular supplements cause horrible inflammation to the intestine.
A lot of people use L-glutamine for the intestines, like for leaky gut. What do you think about that?
Any of the manufactured so-called pure chemicals are risky because in the manufacturing process, every stage it goes through, it can pick up some foreign material in trace amounts. And all it takes for an allergic reaction is a trace that analysis would almost always be invisible. It would take an ultra-fine analysis to guarantee the purity of something like glutamine or glutathione or any of the things sold as pure chemicals.
Okay. Alrighty. Amanda asks, what can one do for histamine mast cell issues? I've had a spot on my foot for the longest time that will just not stop itching, usually when warm from wearing shoes. It used to blister and contain clear liquid that has stopped after a few months following Ray Peat's protocols. I'm about a year and a half in now. I was originally diagnosed with a form of eczema. I've also discovered I have issues with vibration using a percussion massager, so I was told it was due to high histamine levels. Is that true, and what can I do?
Estrogen is the main promoter of an overproduction of mast cells and histamine. And once you get an inflamed area, any part of the body, a place you have had a mosquito bite, for example, mast cells can move in and live forever the rest of your life as a potential site of inflammation. And the local anesthetics happen to be, as far as I know, all of them are functional antihistamines. And so treating the itchy spot with Benadryl or benzocaine ointment or lidocaine ointment, any of those things that stops the itching momentarily can have a long-range therapeutic effect because it's interfering with the histamine production and in a way training the mast cells to become more stable.
Okay, that's good. I like that. I've never thought about it that way before. A person known as I Love Sugar, I think they've asked questions before. Thank you for your question. He asks, please ask Dr. Peat. I read some research that copper supplement absorption is drastically downregulated above 2 milligrams a day. I don't have adequate access to copper-rich foods other than liver. Does Dr. Peat think that eating liver weekly, 3 to 4 ounces, would still cover the RDA requirements for the whole week? I have orange calluses, and is there a way to use liver as a copper supplement without risking vitamin A excess?
Thyroid hormone is probably the major regulator of copper absorption and metabolism because the crucial oxidizing enzyme that thyroid activates, cytochrome C oxidase, is a copper-containing enzyme, and so the increasing your thyroid function increases your ability to absorb and use copper.
Good. Okay. Moving right along. Jimmy asks, what biomarkers to keep track of for longevity? So what biomarkers would you recommend that we keep track of for longevity purposes?
Keeping your lactic acid low and your carbon dioxide high. For over 100 years, insurance companies have known that people living in very high altitude cities, in the Andes, for example, or the Himalayas, these people typically are about 10% lower than the world average in all of the degenerative diseases, dementia, cancer, and heart disease. And even the altitude differences within New Mexico, which are very moderate compared to the Andes and Himalayas, showed the same reduction of degenerative disease. And what happens at high altitude is the lungs are allowed, because there is less oxygen, the lungs are able to retain a much higher level of carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide retention, when you're adapted to high altitude, the carbon dioxide powerfully suppresses lactic acid production. That has been called the lactate paradox of altitude, because you can exercise very intensely and not produce nearly as much lactic acid as you would with the same amount of activity at sea level. And so lactic acid down, carbon dioxide up are the most powerful indicators of good health and long life.
Okay. We are sailing right through these, but we've got a ways to go, so we'll just have to stop at some point, but I'm going to keep going with a few more here. So if we don't get to your question, we'll get to it on the next call, I promise. Luke asks, how does someone become allergic to pork and what to do about it?
I think stopping eating pork is the easiest and possibly the only solution. But you can reduce all of your food sensitivities by keeping your glucose metabolism optimal. And the three things for normalizing maintaining good glucose oxidation are thyroid, calcium intake, and vitamin D. One of Hans Selye's associates did some very good studies on animals showing that food, he arranged allergens from an allergen that would cause very quick death down to one that would cause sniffles in the experimental rats. And then he adjusted. He would give them a little insulin to lower their blood sugar by 50%. And he found that the mild allergen that normally caused sniffles could kill them when their blood sugar was just 50% lower than normal. But then he infused glucose to raise their glucose to 300 milligrams percent, about 3 times normal. And even the deadly allergens with the high glucose produced only the mild sniffles. So your glucose metabolism is almost always the most powerful factor behind those sensitivities. And behind the glucose problem, it's usually calcium, vitamin D, and thyroid, keeping down the toxic hormones such as parathyroid hormone and angiotensin and aldosterone and estrogen and so on.
Yeah, I want to talk more about angiotensin in one of our next podcasts because I want to pick your brain about that. Turkish Postman asks, and this is a really good question. It's kind of personal towards you, Dr. Peat, but it is a really good question. What would Dr. Peat do if he had been diagnosed with cancer?
Several times, about 45 or 50 years ago, 2 or 3 doctors were sure I had at least a precancerous condition. And since I had studied what cancerologists and oncologists do when they biopsy and diagnose a cancer, I had no intention at all of having a specialist confirm that it was even precancerous, because I knew I had absolutely confidence that the treatments were more harmful than the disease. So in the first case, for what was apparently leukoplakia, I increased my vitamin A intake tremendously, and within a week it had disappeared. And I realized I had experienced that previously in the past, and that it was probably accidentally increasing my vitamin A that caused it to disappear. So the leukoplakia of the mouth is essentially similar to what has been diagnosed as a precancerous uterine condition on the cervix. And so I told some women about my experience, and they found the same thing. Their supposedly precancerous cervical condition within a month went back to normal. And in the other case, a doctor, I had my shirt off, and a doctor, actually 2 different individuals at different times, said that really looks like a dangerous melanoma. You should have it checked. And I had been watching it with anxiety at its rapid deformed growth. But I happened to just start experimenting just for other reasons. I was interested in what DHEA would do, especially combined with progesterone. I was taking small amounts of those just about the time the doctor made the comment. And about 3 or 4 days later, I looked down and it looked like I had a maraschino cherry on my belly, where the ugly melanoma had been. It had grown about tenfold over the last few months, and was becoming very deformed looking. But suddenly it was maraschino cherry, and there was a bit of black on it. I thought it had been. I thought it looked like possibly a giant tick inflating with blood, but anyway, I touched it, and the black stuff just fell off, leaving a little blood drop. And over the next couple of days, that glossy red globe shrank away, and it revealed the little brown mole that I had had in that spot all my life until the big black thing started growing. And so over the next 40 years, every time something would pop up looking like developing skin cancer, even to the point of having a bloody spot on it, I would take a little bit of either of those DHEA or progesterone orally, or I found that if I rubbed it into the skin, keeping it about an inch away so that the vitamin E didn't irritate that already irritated area, that the thing looking like a melanoma would simply go away and return to absolutely normal tissue. I had one growth that was the size of a jumbo olive that had come up in just a matter of about a month, and within 2 weeks of this increase of DHEA and progesterone, the whole thing had shriveled away, didn't even leave a scar. And I've had internal symptoms that I suspected were similar processes, polyps and so on. And I've always simply ignored them. The history of prostate cancer treatment, as the treatment was refined through the middle of the last century, prostate cancer mortality continued to increase. In the 1980s, the prostate-specific antigen was discovered and used as a sign that they could give earlier treatment by identifying cancer earlier. And in the early 90s, using the PSA to find cancer at an early stage, not only the diagnosis of prostate cancer increased. At that time, the main treatments were usually systemic estrogen, even if prostate surgery was used to radically remove the gland, the person would usually get large doses of estrogen. But there was this surge of approximately 50% more cancers diagnosed, but the death rate from prostate cancer surged similarly, about a 50% increase in a short time of deaths from prostate cancer. That led to a backing off, and there was a survey of people who specialized in urological cancers. They were asked, the people with a lot of experience in treating prostate cancer, they were asked what they would do if they were diagnosed with prostate cancer. And the great majority of them said nothing, because they had seen that the treatments caused earlier deaths rather than later. And that led to the policy policy of what they call watchful waiting. And if you look at the very few studies starting in the 50s in which they actually compared doing nothing to the quicker treatment and usually surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy. People lived much longer who did nothing. So as far as the evidence exists, it implies that doing nothing is going to be life extending.
I completely agree. My own mom was diagnosed with stomach cancer and was given a 5% chance of living for like 2 to 5 years. And after taking the traditional treatment, the chemo and radiation, she lived 1 year. So had she done nothing, she could have lived longer just dealing with the fact that she had trouble swallowing. And so it's interesting, as you say. I think if we would think more about giving the body the proper conditions to repair, it will do so rather than jumping to the Band-Aid solution. So, yeah, I love that you've experienced it to be what you know is cancer within you, but yet you chose to just provide the body with what it needed. Novel idea. So do you have time for a couple more? We're almost towards the end here. We'll only have a couple of people that don't get their questions answered, and we'll put them in the queue for next time. So this next one is from Epic Killer 30. What is the cause of excess saliva? And I really like the second part of his questions. I'm curious about this. And the common cause of high serotonin in children.
And what was the last question?
The most common cause for high serotonin in children.
In children was the last word?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
The intestine produces 95% of the body's serotonin, and the glands, such as the salivary gland, are very responsive to the composition of the blood. The blood picks up essentially all of the serotonin produced in the intestine, a really large amount of it, and the platelets bind it and carry it to the lungs. As long as there is carbon dioxide adequate in the blood, the platelets are able to firmly hold the serotonin, so the tissues don't experience the serotonin at all as it passes through the bloodstream, heading for the lungs. And the surge of oxygen and the sudden loss of carbon dioxide causes the platelets to release the serotonin, and the serotonin runs into lung enzymes that destroy it. And in experiments, if a person, if you're monitoring their capillaries, you can see the size of the capillary and whether it's being obstructed. If a person hyperventilates and loses too much carbon dioxide all through the body, the platelets become unable to hang on to the carbon dioxide until it reaches the lungs, unable to hang on to the serotonin until they reach the lungs. So they release the serotonin indiscriminately in the bloodstream, and that causes the capillaries, wherever the serotonin is released from capillaries, it causes constriction of the capillaries, and combined with edema, swelling of the wall of the capillary and surrounding tissues, and leakiness of the capillary. So a very bad condition can be set up in the whole body just by hyperventilating enough to lower the CO2 and to interrupt the platelets' function of getting rid of the serotonin.
Mm-hmm.
And anything that makes you tend to not produce enough carbon dioxide, hypothyroidism, for example, leads to what amounts to hyperventilation because you don't have enough CO2 being produced. So the lactic acid comes up throughout your system, and so that can cause the equivalent of serotonin poisoning everywhere. And the parasympathetic nervous overactivity is known to cause excessive salivation, but something like a systemic imbalance of the regulation of both the platelets and the mast cells could contribute to it.
Okay, very good. Okay, final question here. DPS0404 is the name, and they ask, any helpful suggestions for reversing, dissolving the very beginning stages of cataracts?
The actual event happening, surprisingly, the substance becomes stiffer, but actually experience a kind of cellular edema. That's the opaque area of a cataract is wetter, has a higher water content than the normal transparent regions. And estrogen or lack of oxygen is one of the things that can add to this unnatural uptake of water. And caffeine and the stabilizing steroids, everything from cholesterol up through Pregnenalone and progesterone, all of these things help offset that overhydrating effect that stress has. Mm-hmm. So increasing the B vitamins, making sure you're producing enough cholesterol and have enough thyroid that you can convert the cholesterol to the protective hormones. I think that's the basic way to retard the formation. I've known 2 or 3 people. My brother was one of them. When he was about 65, his optometrist said he had cataracts starting. About 10 years later, he had another exam and asked about the cataracts, and the eye doctor said he could see where they had been, but there was no functional cataract left, and he had just been slightly improving his diet, not nearly enough calcium and vitamin D, but made some improvements.
Yes, once again, I think if you give the body the proper conditions, it can do wondrous things. So that's what I appreciate about you, is that you seem to know quite a bit about how to help us give it the proper conditions. So, all right, that wraps it up for today. Dr. Peat, you've been so helpful, and I'm so thankful for you that we can do this, and I look forward to the next one. We already have some questions in the queue for the next time. So where can people find out about you and read more of these awesome publications you were mentioning earlier, as well as taking an order for your newsletter, which I highly recommend?
My website is raypeat.com, and the newsletter information is is at raypeatsnewsletter. It has an S in it, no apostrophe, at gmail.com.
Yeah, and I will have that in the show notes as well. Thank you, Dr. Peat, once again. I always love this with you. So we will reconvene again soon.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye for now. Promo code time. You know what? ATP Science products are some of the best supplements on the market to date that I have used personally and recommended to my nutrition clients for years. They were developed by a naturopathic doctor, and he's meticulous about handcrafted ingredients. And so here's some of my favorite products. The hydrolyzed no-whey collagen protein powder is delectable. The Alpha Prime product helped regulate my hormones after toxic mold exposure. And the CordarX product helped immensely with regulating my cortisol and sleep. And I cannot say enough about their topical rubs, Subcut, and my personal favorite, the Blocky 3. So Blocky 3 is actually really great for blocking harmful estrogen just underneath the skin and preventing that buildup of cellulite and kind of the lumpy bumpies. So I've got a promo code for you for their website, atpscience.com. You get 10% off site-wide, and they have quite a few amazing products. You're going to use coupon code JODELLE, that's JODELLE, to save 10% today on atpscience.com. Go there right now and get your products. I'm like a librarian. Come into my library. Don't mind the excessive blue light because I have blue blockers for you. Oh, there's some sort of schmutz on this one. So with so many options on the Swanwick website, I thought I'd show you some of the different fits and show you just how cool blocking blue light can be and stylish at the same time. My favorite are actually the cat eyes. So I like those the best. It's like I could go to a sock hop. So it's cool. You can actually be stylish and be blocking the blue light at the same time with Swanwick sleep glasses, or Swannies as they're called. Now, not just for adults, okay? So here I have my daughter's little blue blockers. Obviously they're gonna be a little small on me. In case you want them in blue or pink. They also have pink on the website. She likes her purple ones, so I think if I really wanted to, whoops, I dropped that one. If I really wanted to get the benefit of blocking as much blue light as possible, I could simply, okay, I think that's really gonna do it as far as, yeah, okay. So there you have options. Now these here, these are the fit overs that fit over, like when I wear my glasses, I'll put these on and they fit over. So for people that wear glasses, there's that option. Then for people that are looking for daylight blocking, we have the day blockers in the black, but if you don't want the black, then you have the two-tone. So there's those. Can you tell I have a little bit of an addiction to blue blockers? So while I was making the video, I forgot I had these too. So these are kind of like the clear Wayfarers. So I literally have, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, well, 9 pairs if you count my daughter's 2 pair. I have an issue. SwanwickSleep.com. Get Fit is the code, GETFIT, to save 10% and find a pair that works for you. What are you going to pick? Post below and let me know.